We are delighted to host this event during the week of July 4th. The Jewish community has much to be grateful for in the United States, where we enjoy equal rights under the law. No other country has been as welcoming to the Jewish people as the United States. In 1790, George Washington famously wrote a letter to the Jewish community in Newport, Rhode Island. In his letter, Washington assured them of religious liberty and expressed his vision for a nation where all individuals would enjoy freedom of worship without fear of persecution. One of the most famous excerpts from his letter is, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of all other inhabitants. While everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, there shall be none to make him afraid." America has remained true to this promise, despite the challenges we face, including the rise of anti-Semitism. Nevertheless, we know that this miracle, America, guided by its Constitution, continues to be a beacon of light and equality for all. Many of us here, myself included, owe our lives to the brave men and women who risked everything to free Europe from hatred and the Nazi invasion. They welcomed us with open arms, allowing us to start anew in this free world. In today's talk, we will explore how Hebraic thought has influenced the founding of America and how the basic tenets of American politics have roots in Jewish thought. We're privileged to have here Rabbi Crispe, a scholar par excellence who has spoken here quite a few times. His thoughts and ideas have been warmly welcomed and received with great interest. He's a sought-out speaker throughout the United States. We welcome Rabbi Crispe.
So it's wonderful to be here. I just want to start by dedicating this class to the Refuah Shlema, the complete recovery of Harav Yitzhak Feivish ben Brian Amalka. I also want to warn everyone that I've never given this talk before. This is a brand new talk. So it's somewhere between 5 minutes and 5 hours long. We'll see, or I'm not sure exactly. I brought props, but there's plenty of food if people need recovery, during it, okay? So we'll see where we get to. But this is titled "The Building on the Promised Land: The Continuum of Hebraic Political Thought in New World America." And we're going to focus on a few key themes today. One is human fallibility and imperfection. We're going to talk about checks and balances or separation of powers. Some of this stuff is really hot button issues in modern day America. And we're also going to talk about getting beyond what's known as the sovereign exception, and we'll explain what that means. And then we'll also ask questions regarding whether or not politics can be rectified without a commitment to, if not religiosity, at least a moral order in the world. So those will be the key themes and so on. But in order to do this, we're going to travel back to the 17th century. So we'll go back in time a little bit. And most historians kind of convey a sense that the changes that are happening in the world politically in those times are because of Renaissance humanism. And we're experiencing something known as the Great Divide. Basically, we're starting to bracket religious thought, and there's like an independent kind of secular thought that's emerging, and the character of that secular thought is undeniably Greco-Roman in nature. It has its roots in pagan culture and not in traditional monotheistic religious traditions. That's the portrait of overarchingly what has been taught for decades and decades and decades in that time. And a new crop of scholars have come around, and they've basically challenged this assertion in profound ways. And they've tried to bring an avalanche of evidence to in fact show that much of what was happening in the world, especially vis-a-vis political experiments and political changes, political reformations, were the result of political theologies. And those political theologies were strikingly Hebraic in nature. In fact, there was a great aspiration especially amongst first Christian Europe, but then later even in the American political experiment, to resurrect or reenact or to lay claim to something akin to a Hebrew commonwealth. That the days of God ruling upon the land in ancient Israel somehow are the new constitution that we would like to establish. We're trying to figure out what that relationship was like. And a lot of this was born out of the new technology in the world, what Marshall McLuhan called the Gutenberg galaxy. We have an explosion of print culture, starting with the invention of movable type and the printing press and the 1440s, and of course the Gutenberg Bible comes out in 1456. And then you get thousands of titles that are seeing the light of day for the first time, and it's not then surprising that starting in the 16th century, you get all kinds of new hybrid thought systems that are starting to happen as different cultures, different philosophies, different belief systems are starting to communicate with one another. First Hebrew book, we believe, was printed in 1469, so a very short window after the very first book that Gutenberg printed. So really was a technology that was launched right away. What many people don't realize, however, is that there became a sense by a whole class of scholars that were known as Christian Hebraists that we need to rediscover the world. We need to discover the Hebraic Bible in its original language. And the printing press afforded this. And therefore, there was great investment in both book printing to that end, and then also learning that centered around those types of things. One of the figures who was most famous for this was named Daniel Bomberg. Daniel Bomberg operated the most famous printing press in the first half of the 16th century in Venice. He employed some 200 rabbis at its peak, and he printed for over 30 years. We find between 1517 and 1519 that the first Mikrot Gedolot, the first Pentateuch, the first 5 books of Moses, was printed with the common attending commentaries, famous rabbinical commentaries that many people are familiar with today who have the habit of learning such text with commentary. But that was a novelty in Europe. No one had ever seen that before. So people wanted to learn this language. They wanted to understand it. Of course, then from 1519 to 1522, he prints the first Talmud for the very, very first time. The Talmud, it launches an even further sense of discovery that's happening in the world, and he goes on to print many more titles. But one of the most common things that he would print were Hebrew grammars for people who actually wanted to learn the Hebrew language. They could discover all this stuff that was hidden in the Hebrew original of these texts and in the rabbinic tradition. So I brought a Bomberg book with me. It's been reprinted, but this is a work called Sefer Tzachot B'Dikduk. It's a book that elucidates Hebrew grammar. And you can see here Venetia. It's been rebound. Venetia is Venice. And it's in the year Shin Vav, which is 1546. So this book is from 1546 I'm holding. I was actually in a used bookstore, and in the bargain bin, they had a bunch of unbound books that were discounted, and I picked this up for $20 and put a new binding on it. But it was printed 3 years after Copernicus died in 1543, so it's quite old. And you'll notice it has Italian script on it, and this was most likely preserved in one of the medieval universities or monasteries, was being learned at that time. How do we gain access to Hebrew? And this is, in fact, right here at the beginning, Daniel Bomberg. It's one of his books that he printed during that period of time. So many of the works that were common then are of this nature. How do we gain access to this? How do we gain access to these primary texts? And then how did they change thought? And particularly, how did they change political thought at the time? So we have a number of scholars that emerges as around this that are actually, they're not Jewish. many of them never met Jews, depending upon where they live in the world, but they are interested in pursuing this revival of the Hebrew language and accessing these texts and figuring them out and puzzling through problems with the help of rabbinic commentary. By the mid-17th century, we already find some 1,300 works that were published, usually with some Hebrew quotation or Aramaic quotation in them, by this new class of scholars known as Hebraists. And some of the most famous, actually, I've come and represented here. We always have to have a little show and tell when I do this. So this particular volume comes from Johannes Buxtorf. There's actually Buxtorf the elder and Buxtorf the younger, right? And he lived from 1564 to 1629. Both he and his son were scholars of all things Jewish. In fact, he was known as like the master of the rabbis for all the stuff that he had studied, and he translated many things for the first time into Latin. It was almost mind-blowing that many of the most famous works of Jewish thought often appeared in Latin before they were even printed in Hebrew. One such example is Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Formation, which is printed actually in Latin translation in France in 1552, but only is printed in the original Hebrew in Mantova, Italy in 1562. So you have quite a lot of examples of things like that, and various legal codes and even tractates of the Talmud were translated. He translated a lot, but he gave like a comprehensive study of Jewish life and thought in this particular work. And this was originally published in 1603, and an updated edition came out in 1661. So this is the 1661 of Buxtorf, and this would have been very, very commonly studied and circulated throughout Europe. It was reprinted many times. Interestingly, this was even something that would have been familiar to many of the founding fathers, would have known about Buxtorf's work. He's one of the most famous in history for that reason. Not to outdo him too much, but we find in England, there's another figure. Buxtorf is German, but in England, at a time when there was no Jews, and in my previous talk I spoke a little bit about these people, but it's worth re-mentioning them because it builds the case of evidence that I've tried to assemble here today for where all this is headed. In England, we find under Charles II a tyrannical reign, and one of the members of parliament was named John Selden. And John Selden's born in 1584, he lives to 1654. And Selden gets a little bit in hot water, and ruffles some feathers, and the king is not terribly happy with him. So he ends up being incarcerated in the Tower of London. And what are you going to do? There's no cable back then, no Wi-Fi. So he borrows the Bomberg edition of the Talmud from Westminster Abbey, which is nearby, as he's in the Tower of London, and he proceeds to learn the entire Talmud from one end to the other. He was an accomplished polymath, knew at least a half dozen languages, including Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, Latin, Italian, and other languages. And when he got stuck, he would pen letters to Italian rabbis, because there were no Jews in England at the time. And after the regicide of King Charles II and the leadership that was asserted of Oliver Cromwell, Selden and Cromwell were quite close. His influence being quite philo-Semitic in his attitude, even though he never met a Jew, just based on what he was studying, may very well have been one of the leading factors that prompted Cromwell and others to allow the return of Jews for the first time in centuries back into what we think of as England today. So one of the 6 volumes that Selden wrote in the 1600s on Jewish thought applies to our topic today of government, and that's this particular book right here. This was printed in 1695, and is still in the original binding. So it holds up. It's not like books today, right? They fall apart, they're like glued. This is like when they really made books last, right? So this is 1695, and this is Tractate Sanhedrin of the Talmud, which, amongst other things, deals not only with the court system, the judicial system, but also with the monarchy or the executive system, let's call it. It has Parshat HaMelech, right? The portion that deals with kings. Do we have a limited monarchy or an unlimited monarchy? How does it work? So because he was a polymath and a polyglot, and you will see things translated from Hebrew and Aramaic to Latin and Greek and other languages in here, it's really quite amazing. This opened up a whole world of rabbinic scholarship for the first time to non-native speakers, non-Jewish scholars. He was incredibly impressive in terms of legal theory. Much of Talmudic law that he studied actually crept into English law in very specific cases, specifically related to marriage and divorce, and some of his thoughts about natural law and universal codes of conduct. He ends up influencing an American intellectual who is friends with like basically all the founding fathers, including George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and Ben Franklin. And I spoke about him in my last talk, so I'm not going to reiterate that. You probably can find it online. I think it was recorded. But I did procure a rare text since I was here last, so I will mention it. The individual who was influenced by Selden and then introduces a lot of his thought into the mind and imagination of our founding fathers was Ezra Stiles, who would become, in 1778, the 7th president of Yale College. But even before he became the president of Yale College, he was fascinated by Jewish mysticism, and it had tremendous influence. That was the subject of our previous talk. So I have here, this is Dr. Stiles' discourse. This is an original copy from 1770. I found this after I gave the talk here the last time. But not only is this an original copy from 1770, this has a dedication up here in handwritten from Ezra Stiles to his daughter. This was her personal copy that he gave to her in 1772. So it's before he actually went to the Newport Synagogue to learn with Rabbi Chaim Cargill, for people who heard that previous talk. But you can already see evidence of his fascination with all things related to Jewish thought, especially as it pertained to how we should think about kings and government and so on. So amazingly here, pinned into this work, very delicately, those are the notes of Ezra Stiles' daughter from 1772, like pinned into the book. And on this side of the page, he mentions Zohar and Sefer Yetzirah, two classics of Jewish mysticism, as being very influential on him and very important to understanding contemporary, for his time, politics. So there it is in 1770 in print, an original. Lest you think I'm making it up, it's always important to bring physical evidence if you can. So that is a great example of sort of where things were moving at the time. There's a couple other steps along the way. I mentioned this book was from 1651. Does anyone know what famous work of political thought was published in 1651? Huh? No, that's actually several centuries earlier. No, Montesquieu is about 90 years after the Spirit of the Law. We're going to talk about Montesquieu. So it's a trip for an extra piece of dessert here, if you know the answer. It's a big fish story. It's actually the Leviathan of Thomas Hobbes. And Hobbes was actually an acolyte of John Selden. So much of Hobbes' understanding of political thought actually came from Selden. And he thought, looking at the ancient Hebraic commonwealth in ancient Israel, that we should see that God establishes kings, and those kings have a very important role to play in this world. And when we use phrases like God being a king over the world, like we don't mean like in Olam Haba, the world to come, but like God should exercise sovereignty over this world, and that should manifest with an actual representative, like a monarch, that would appear in the world. So he actually acknowledges, though, and we'll talk more about this, that sometimes, like if you don't set the monarch up in the right way, that actually is displacing God's rule and could be displeasing. But of course, if you ever run into someone studying political science, you can ask, so who do you like more, Hobbes or Locke? Hobbes, of course, believed that once you were placed as king, you were installed as the sovereign, you had absolute rule. The king's rule was sort of like synonymous with God's rule. John Locke took a more moderate position. Like kings had more limited monarchy and perhaps could be replaced. And so the question is, like, are both of these things somehow traceable to readings, not just of the Hebraic Bible, but actually to rabbinic texts about what we think about of as the Torah or the Hebraic Bible in general? And that's exactly what we're going to see. So the last figure that I want to talk about of these particular scholars, I just acquired an original copy of his work, but it did not make it here today. I really wish I could, because it's such a key to this whole talk. I was hoping to be able to show you. He was also, like Buxdorf, a German Hebraeus, and his name was Wilhelm Sichard. He lives from 1592 to 1635, and he writes in 1625 a work that's called Mishpat HaMelech. It's called the King's Law. The King's Law, that is the work. So an updated, an expanded edition was published in 1674, and there was one in the world that I could find, and I had to buy it. So I apologize it didn't make it here by this talk, but I'm hoping to show it to you, and it would be quite sensational to understand where this factors in the 1776 in the American Revolution. But this work on the King's Law by this particular scholar is unbelievable, because not only does he look at the original Hebrew texts that deal with kingship and government, he also assembles all of the Talmudic and later rabbinic texts about those passages that are so critical. So for the very first time, available in Latin to a non-Hebrew speaking audience, are all these rabbinic texts. And everyone is fascinated by this, absolutely fascinated by it. It actually ends up completely captivating a scholar not much later from its publication who studied at Cambridge. My wife and I actually just came back. We were at Cambridge University visiting our son there, and we got to go hang out in the Cairo Geniza, so you could handle like 1,000-year-old texts, which was absolutely unbelievable, including some that pertain to our subject now. It was really absolutely unbelievable. But he was a student at Cambridge, and then of course became a great poet. His name was John Milton. Many people have maybe heard of John Milton and Paradise Lost. What many people don't know is that Milton was a enormous scholar of all things Jewish. He was a Hebraeus on some level, and it's reflected even in his magnum opus, Paradise Lost, that clearly he was aware of what's known as midrashic literature, which is like, I call it deleted scenes and directed commentary on the Torah. It's like extensions filling in terms of extending the story and explanatory gaps in the text. And if you're an exegete and you're trying to expound upon these texts, looking at midrashic literature is very, very important, especially related to those things having to do with kings. So you see that in some of the choices he makes in Paradise Lost. You see it in many of his other writings. And not only was Milton aware of John Selden, who we mentioned before, but primarily he was very interested in Mishpat HaMelech, the King's Law from Sichard. So to just give you a small sampling of what's come out on Milton. This is just a few of the books in my library on him. So we have Milton and the Jews, Torah and Law in Paradise Lost, Milton and the Rabbis, and Milton and Medrash. It's all New York Times bestsellers, I guarantee you. Every single one of these is, forget Eat, Pray, Love. This is really what everyone was reading. So you can see that he's like very steeped in this, John Milton. So what are the passages in particular that change Milton's view? It's an analysis of an episode that appears in the first book of Samuel, Shmuel, Aleph, in the 8th chapter. And it's basically, to set the stage for you a little bit, the prophet Samuel, Shmuel, is aging, and his sons are supposed to take over for him, but they don't follow exactly in their father's ways. There's a little bit of seemingly on the surface corruption that's going on there. And so the people come to him and say, we would like you to give us a king. We would like a king. But they don't just say we would like a king. We'd like a king kol hagoyim. This is Samuel 8:5, right? Therefore appoint a king for us to govern us like all other nations. Okay, so what's the significance of this? It seems like it's, okay, is that a problem? Yes or no? It actually turns out to be, this passage is enormously contentious, even in rabbinic writings. Like, what exactly does it mean? And God responds to Samuel and says basically in 2 lines later, heed the demand of the people in everything they say to you. For it is not you that they have rejected, it is me they have rejected as their king. So wanting an earthly king seems to be like rejecting God as king and sovereign, right? That seems to be what's going on. And so that's where it starts, the problem. But then he continues. And he says, if you have a king that rules over them, and he goes on, he basically says all the thing the king's going to do. He's going to tax you. He's going to take your sons and daughters. They're going to be enlisted in national public works projects. They'll be building interstates and have toll booths and in the army and God knows what else. Finally, and you shall become his slaves, right? So it seems to be antithetical to the liberation that occurs in the Exodus, right? Where we're like freed from an earthly king, where seems to be trading that. And so there's this almost admonishment and this warning, and the people still insist, no, we want a king. Give us a king. Okay, you're getting a king. And then the question is, what happens as a result of that? There seems to be like very different interpretations of, like, you have good kings and bad kings in ancient Israel, and it goes in a variety of different directions. But is it really so problematic? Because don't we have an earlier passage that actually appears in the book of Deuteronomy, of Devarim 27, chapter 27, where it seems like there's God telling us to appoint a king at a certain point. And so looking at chapter 27, starting with verse 14, Ki tavo el haaretz, right? When you go into the land that God has assigned you, and you take possession of it and you settle it, then you shall say, right, or you will say, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me. Doesn't that sound pretty much identical what we had before? There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of daylight between it. But this passage actually continues on, and it actually gives some stipulations of what this sovereign can do. It doesn't seem to be the absolute sovereign of Hobbes, but a limited sovereign. In particular, the king is not allowed to have more horses than necessary. Horses, of course, figure as like the cavalry and like certain basic needs, but you can't go overblown on horses. And particularly, the most interesting one is, nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. So that seems to be like limited taxation on the king, right? You can't go too over the board with all that. And even more so, this king has to keep a copy of the Torah scroll with him so they may learn to revere God, and he has to read from it all the days of his life. So the Torah scroll acts like something constitutional. And so the monarchy is provided for, but a limited monarchy. And he can't do whatever he wants, the king, on all these things. And finally, it like reaches its summary. He will not act haughtily towards his fellows or deviate from the instruction to the right or the left. So he's very much bound by this constitution. The sovereign, like this is where we get into like what we call sovereign exception, which we'll explain more. Like, does the king make laws, but is he not bound by laws? Right? That's an interesting question that has come up very recently, providentially, like in the Supreme Court, right? Is the executive, the chief executive, able to make laws but not be bound by those same laws? This is actually in the news today. And this is exactly what's going on in this particular case. So we find Maimonides, Rambam, who lived 800 years ago, and one of the most amazing things in the Cairo Geniza was I got to hold handwritten documents of the Rambam, like his actual writing, the manuscripts from which this stuff comes. They have it there. So like holding these 800-year-old manuscripts was absolutely mind-blowing experience. But he actually concludes his legal compendium talking about the laws of kings and their wars. And he cites these same passages, like he's talking about the text in Samuel, he's talking about the text in Deuteronomy, and he says as follows, it seems to him it is a mitzvah, a positive commandment, to appoint a king. So then why was God displeased in Samuel that the people asked for one, right? They made the request. It shouldn't be that way. And the answer, he says, is because they made the request in the spirit of a complaint. Right? That was his particular idea. So instead of properly having a king and it going through the correct channels, it was in a way rejecting, not God even first and foremost, but rejecting Samuel, because Shmuel, the prophet, he's acting in a way as the de facto leader. So he's being rejected in that way. And so there's some idea like, can you not reject the current system and supplant it? Are you allowed to do that or not? Like, which way does it go? But he further codifies the laws regarding the checks against a unlimited sovereign, which are so interesting. I'll just mention a few of them because they are kind of fascinating, and this goes into our checks and balances and the sovereign exception question that we'll talk more about. But he points out that this king should be gracious and merciful to small and great, involving himself in their good and welfare. He should protect and honor even the humblest of men. So that's like a real clear, restriction what he should do. And furthermore, he should always conduct himself with great humility. We might say that the biggest rectification of modern day politics could be to infuse it with greater humility. Like, I think maybe that's something that would be good to ponder and to think about. But then in terms of his excessive horse gathering or requisitioning, or taking on too much money, it finds if he does that, if he violates those limitations and is excessive in his government spending, he can be lashed. So I don't know if anyone's been lashed for overspending by the government in the Rose Garden of the White House, but this is quite interesting. That's not what we normally think of as like an unlimited sovereign. And interestingly, the work, Mishpat HaMelech, the King's Law, goes through and looks at the different commentators, not only the Rambam, but many others, how they understand this particular view and what the different options are, and tries to even maybe harmonize between them. So option number one is that ancient Israelites sinned by selecting kings that didn't meet the correct criteria. Right? Like maybe we also today have to think about what is good criteria for electing our leaders as well, right? Like, so the problem was not that they wanted a king, but that they didn't have the right criteria. That was the issue. So they constituted a king that was sort of contrary to God's instructions. That was the first thing gleaned. And by the way, these gleanings are specifically from the rabbinic commentary, including in Tractate Sanhedrin, which they're getting from the King's Law and also from Selden's book for the first time in Latin translation, starting around page 20, side B, if anyone wants to look it up afterwards, in Tractate and Sanhedrin. You start getting these different views back and forth. So then the second thing is we contrast that. It's not so much that they asked for a king, it's rather that they wanted to change the government. They were changing God's established order. Now think about this in Europe at the time. Like if the king is God's representative and you want to change kings, like what happened with Charles II with the regicide, they took him out being tyrannical, right? Is that allowed, or would that be transgressing against God? You got to accept whatever the established order is. Like this is the ultimate status quo philosophy, seemingly, right? Whatever is set up, that's the way it's supposed to be. Don't muck with it anyway. So therefore, preaching rebellion is not just basically rejecting magistrates or other offices, it's also rejecting God in a second level of interpretation that goes on. So these are views that are attained. Maybe it's this, maybe it's that. What is the third view? The third view actually introduces basically into like political science vocabulary something that comes from Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian, where he talks about a theocracy. God is the ultimate ruler in the world, and therefore we don't want to usurp God's role as the true king and place, something else in God's stead. That would be like insurrection against God. So it doesn't have so much to do with the earthly king. It has to do with like maybe choosing an earthly king that's not following what God wants. So there could be a disalignment there. There's some kind of misalignment that's happening between what the earthly ruler is doing and God is the ultimate ruler. And in that gap, you would have motivation for saying, okay, we need some change here, and that could be quite important to where we come about, right? So this is huge. But one of the texts that comes out of this from the rabbinical tradition has to do with the expression Ve'amarta, and when you come into the land and you shall say, we will set a king upon us, right? The context of it suggests that it's like just a descriptive, right? You come to the land and like, of course you will say, like it's just anticipating what will happen when you come into the land, that you'll want to set up a king like other people have kings. That's what you'll want to do, right? But actually, the whole phrase, according to the rabbinic tradition, can be read a little bit differently. Instead of you will say, it could be you shall say in the imperative, meaning that God's telling us to establish a king, an earthly king. Oh, that's very different, right? Then like we might, okay, we'll probably want one, so all right, it's tolerated, to you must, it's a positive commandment. It's read actually as a positive commandment to set up a king, right? And so in the various Talmudic discussions, Rabbi Yehuda understands it as a positive commandment, and Rabbi Elazar ben Sadok says we can ask for a king, but we should not have one like all the other nations. Our king has to be aligned with the Constitution, which is the Torah here. So in this way, the Talmud, in this particular passage called Parshat HaMelech, the portion dealing with the executive branch of government, actually influences a lot of political divides that occur in the 17th and 18th century when thinking about this. Like, must we establish a king if the king is not aligned with some higher ideal that the king is bound by? It's a limited monarchy, therefore we could rebel and remove the king, or should we not have a king to begin with, right? Like that's what's going on. Now, there's one additional text that is quoted in this work, the King's Law, Mishpat HaMelech, and that comes from a midrashic source. It's separate from the Talmud, but also has a great antiquity to it. And it's the medrash known as Devarim Rabbah. It's the great medrash on Deuteronomy. And on chapter 27, it says the following, basically, that I planned you to be free from kings, God says. And I'll read you a couple of passages from it. I think you'll find interesting. My children, I have thought to let you free from kingship. Right? How do you know? For it is stated in Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, a wild donkey that is used to the wilderness, just like a wild donkey grows up in the wilderness, does not fear man. So I thought that you would not have to fear kingship upon you. Right? So there's a whole analysis of, it's like God seems to be saying you should have no king whatsoever. Like only God is king. There's no earthly king in that regard. And then Rabbi Shimon, basically, who says in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, anyone who trusts in God merits to be like him. How do we know? It says, again, Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, blessed is the man who trusts in God, whose hope is in God. But anyone who places trust in pagan worship, he becomes indebted to be like it. How do we know? It says in Psalms and Tehillim, may they who make them become like them. And our rabbi says, anyone who relies on man transgresses. Even for his protection, he transgresses. So why did the ancient Israelites and Samuel and Shmuel want a king like the nations? They thought kings lead you into battle, they organize the army, they provide protection. So we need that. And it says in Psalms 146, Tehillim, in humans who cannot save, right? So to conclude, like God says, they know that humans are nothing, yet they put aside my glory and say, appoint for us a king. What do you want a king for? By your lives, your end will be to feel that what will happen to you in the future under the reign of your kings, right? And then he concludes with the last line, all their kings have fallen, and none among them, and there is none among them who call me. So that's the conclusion. So this seems to be the most extreme view of all that is attested to in this particular work. So the agitator, known as John Milton, reads this, right? He's reading Mishpat Melech, the King's Law, and he reads this and he says, yes, I also find this detestable that we have this king who's not a fan of Charles II by any stretch of the imagination. We shouldn't have kings altogether. God should just be king, but we shouldn't have an earthly king in any way. And it concludes basically that monarchy itself is sin. That's Milton's conclusion, that it's tantamount to idolatry to give any human being the status of a king. This is what Milton concludes. Now, let's take our time machine a little bit into the future, and let's go into the 18th century, and let's stop in 1776, if you will. And I have here one volume of the complete writings of Thomas Paine, and he penned a little pamphlet, some 46 pages in length, known as Common Sense. And you open and you open him, and you see the following. In the second section, page 14 in this edition, monarchy is ranked in Scripture as one of the sins of the Jews, for which a curse is denounced against them. And then he goes into the whole history, and he talks about what happens with Shmuel, with Samuel, and the people asking for a king. And basically, he quotes the exact passage we already read. He says, for they have not rejected thee, Samuel, God saying to Samuel, but they have rejected me that I should reign over them. So it's this exact passage that he's reading, and he continues, and he actually goes on and on about all the punishment that happens if you ask for a king. And no one figured out for a while where it came from, except for it was discovered that there's a conversation that occurred between Thomas Paine and John Adams. And in that conversation, Paine said, all that stuff I put in Common Sense that was the biblical reason to get rid of a king, all comes from John Milton. Where did John Milton get it from? Mishnah Melech, the text that I quoted earlier, which is the King's Law. So actually, it's all directly from rabbinic interpretations, and specifically from this rabbinic medrash known as Devarim Rabbah that Thomas Paine's change. And if you actually look at America up until this pamphlet goes out, there was actually quite a lot of attachment to kings still. Monarchy was not entirely out of vogue. Whether you wanted to replace the king with another king, that was a separate question. But this view that kingship itself needed to be gotten rid of as a form of government, that actually comes from this rabbinic text all the way through, and now it's traceable. So I'm sorry I couldn't bring you the original. He's quoting Milton, Milton's quoting the earlier text, but that was the basis of what was transpiring. I actually have a picture of it. Here's the title page of Mishnah Melech. Can't really see it too well, but basically, as a result of this, Eric Nelson, who's a professor of government, especially history of government at Harvard University, he writes in the Hebrew Republic, we really have to think of this time as not the time of Hobbes, because Hobbes definitely believes in an absolute sovereign being installed, but really we were living in the age of Milton. John Milton is the bigger influence, and Milton, it's really all coming through all this Hebraicism for the first time. So that gets us through the idea of kingship on a base level, but why would a king also be considered, in some sense, like not a good absolute ruler? Like, does the king have access to all the information? Is the king all-knowing? Like, would the king have that kind of character if we're talking about a worldly king? How do we understand it, right? So in terms of this idea of a king being tantamount to idolatry, we might ask, what is idolatry supposed to represent? It actually represents representational government. The king is representing for God, more so even than for the people. And there are, of course, limits of representation. You can never have a clear, from a Jewish standpoint, there's never like a perfect human flesh and blood embodiment of the absolute. There's something about reality itself that doesn't lend itself to that. So the Constitution that we have reflects the fact that people are not all-knowing and that we have human fallibility, and maybe that's actually a part of our political reality. I had mentioned before that figures like Ezra Stiles, who's communicating with all the major founding fathers, was steeped not only in these rabbinic traditions that have to do with the Talmud, but was also talking about Jewish mysticism. So this comes across even more powerfully, I think, in Jewish mysticism, this particular idea that has to do with the nature of reality itself. Is reality deep down uncertain, so we can never like know it with total perfect certainty? Maybe God can from God's perspective, but from our perspective there's always a degree of uncertainty. So it actually says that the highest part of a king's crown in Jewish mysticism, what's called the Keter, is called Radla, Resha de lo yada v'lo et yada, that which is not known and can never be known. And in later strata of rabbinic writing, sometimes we refer to this as emunah, as faith. So faith is actually something that's actually like a surplus of that which is beyond knowledge, escapes knowledge altogether. And it seems to be like a key part of reality. And at this particular highest level of faith, reality is actually defined as fundamentally uncertain. You cannot fully know it. It's almost like in quantum mechanics. You can't perfectly determine both the position and momentum of a subatomic particle. The more you know about one, the less you know about the other. There's like a level of actual uncertainty woven into the very fabric of the universe. So the term here that's used in Jewish mysticism for uncertainty is suffix, which literally means like a doubt, but it's like a state of uncertainty. And there's a juxtaposition in Jewish liturgy between two statements that are very popularly recited over and over and over again that have to do with what's known as the Shema prayer. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is God, the Lord is one. And that particular line that's recited actually refers to pulling all of creation back into the divine itself, that everything is really just God and there's a divine unity to everything. So that's like God's perspective. It's like called the higher unity, the higher unification, the higher awareness of reality. And there you could talk about certainty, but the way our understanding of reality has to do with even God's kingship, the way God is revealed in the world. And that's the follow-up line, which actually in Jewish tradition is whispered, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Li'olam Va'ed. So blessed is the name of the glory of his kingdom forever and ever, is that line. So it has something to do with like kingdom and government, and it has to do with a name, and a name is how you show yourself to the outside. So it's about divine expressivity through creation, and it's our perspective on reality. So the Kabbalists say something mind-blowing about this, that if you look at these two phrases, every Hebrew letter is also a number, and the Torah acts as like a cryptogram. There's like information encoded on a multitude of levels, and one of them is mathematical. So the first phrase, which is God's perspective, Hear, O Israel, if we took all of those words, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, Hear, O Israel, God is our God, God is one. How much does that equal if every letter is now a number and you add them all up? This is the Kabbalistic imagination that Ezra Stiles in 1770 is already fascinated by. How much does it equal? So it's 1,118. You'd get an extra dessert if you could do that in your head. But 1,118. So how much is the phrase, which is Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Li'olam Va'ed, blessed is the name of the glory of his kingship forever and ever, our perspective on reality, not God's perspective of reality. How much does that equal if all those letters in Hebrew are translated into numbers? It's 1,358. So what's the difference between the two? Like if you subtract 1,118 from 1,158, 1,358, it's 240 is the difference between the two. So very famously in Jewish mysticism, 240 is suffix, is doubt or uncertainty. So meaning like shifting and register from God's perspective, we can perfectly be an executor over all reality. To our framing of reality introduces a level of uncertainty. It's like if you're into statistics and other like fringe levels of mathematics, it'd be called like a Markov blanket. But that's for another talk at another time. But this level of uncertainty shows up in really key ways in the work on Sanhedrin, which is a different branch of government, not just with kings, but with the judicial system. We have a Sanhedrin, say the Supreme Court, right? Today's Supreme Court's making great news. So we're seeing it's a hot topic even today. So in the Tractate Sanhedrin, we have an interesting question, and this is where this uncertainty shows up, and it has to do with ruling, whether you're the sovereign, whether you're in the executive branch, whether you're in the judicial branch. It's very, very important. Where does the uncertainty show up? If you have a capital case and all the judges come back and they are unanimous that the person's to be put to death, what happens? Huh? I can't hear. So it would be like saying a mistrial or the person's like released, right? Like what do we do in America if everyone, like you don't put the person to death unless you have the executive branch can. We're talking about the judicial branch. So if the Supreme Court hits a case and it comes back unanimous, it's the equivalent of what we think of today as a mistrial, right? Like it's they're not found guilty. Why? Because if one judge couldn't find some extenuating circumstances, some doubt, reasonable doubt, that it means that they didn't look at the case closely enough, because reality itself is intrinsically fuzzy at the deepest level.
Like a hung jury.
So today we would have a hung jury, but in Sanhedrin, this is totally mind-blowing shift. It actually suggests that there's fallibility, like that there's got to be a level of ambiguity for the judgment and assessment of everything that exists in the world. Now, normally we think of doubt as a very negative thing, that it's oppositional to faith, like it's something that assails faith, it's in conflict with faith. But that's actually a degenerated sense of it. Because really the word suffix is not just doubt, it's uncertainty. So there's like bad uncertainty, toxic uncertainty, unhealthy uncertainty, but there's actually what's called suffix b'emuna in l'malyuta, a uncertainty that's part of faith, fundamental unknowability that's positive. Like it's faith because I can't totally determine it with knowledge, right? So there's a fundamental uncertainty at that level of reality. It just changes over time. So there's actually a figure that represents negative uncertainty, that besides appointing a king, like one of the key things that goes along with appointing the king is trying to get rid of the Amalekites. The Amalekites is this nation that is like our arch rival nemesis. It's trying to obliterate us. But the identity of this particular nation is what we call a free-floating signifier. Basically, it's not fixed to just a historical identity. Whatever particular group in whatever generation you happen to exist that wants to destroy the Jewish people has the designation of the Amalekites. In our generation, they're called Hamas. Like in the previous generation, they were called Nazis, Yamak Shema. But we understand that it changes over time. And like there's something about this name, Amalek, who's like the principal root of it. This is like a genealogy that we're performing, that in its numerical value, that word equals suffix, which is a doubt or an uncertainty. In the negative sense, like I'm not sure what's real. Do we live in a world in common? Do I know what to believe anymore? It can lead to nihilism and other things that are caused by doubt in its negative sense, but its origin actually started in something positive. So doubt and uncertainty is usually very toxic in politics. Do you ever recall hearing a presidential debate where someone was like, well, I'm really not sure. Let me think about it some more. I'm studying the issue, right? No matter what, we have a sort of impulse, a drive, a demand upon us to always speak and to speak with conviction, even if we don't know. But this is where the Torah tries to perhaps rectify politics a little bit, that maybe there should be a level of uncertainty. Everything doesn't have to be super high conviction, and this is because reality itself is fuzzy. It's intrinsically fuzzy. This is the idea. And the genealogy, this is how the 16th century Kabbalists who influenced Stiles and others, known as the Arizal, spoke about it. And I'll give you very briefly. We were actually in the Cairo Geniza, we were able to hold the only surviving handwritten document with a signature from the Arizal. That was also a very precious moment. He lived from 1534 to 1572. So it was actually a business document, but it had his signature. It was very, very special to be able to hold that at that time. So what does he say? The genealogy. There are 5 generations articulated both in the book of Genesis and again in the book of Chronicles about Amalek, the Amalekites that represent uncertainty or doubt. But where do they come from? So the first in the lineage is actually not his father or his grandfather or his great-grandfather, but his great-great-grandfather, who's Abraham. It's as though and Abraham represents the beginning of faith in Jewish tradition. So it means that like his descendant is associated with uncertainty and doubt, but that means that originally doubt actually is part of this uncertainty that faith is because it's beyond knowledge, because reality is fuzzy. And then the next level, his great-grandfather is Isaac, Yitzchak. And his father is Esau, is Esav. And then his father is Eliphaz. And then Amalek himself. So those are the 5 levels that the Torah elucidates. You might be like, why do we even have to know? He's a bad guy. We're supposed to get rid of him. The king has to contend with him. This is very important, right? The king has to contend with this. And this is a big part of human fallibility and checks and balances, like have to contend with uncertainty. What does it mean to operate under uncertainty as a leader, right? It's really important themes that we could explore in more detail. So why this whole Genesis? So the Arizal says as follows: what happens if we take the numerical value of these 5 generations and add them up? So Avraham in Hebrew is 248. Isaac, Yitzchak is 208. This is going to get a big prize if you do the math correct here. Esav is 376. Eliphaz, his father, is 128, and then Amalek is 240. So if you add all those numbers, it's like this. I mentioned in my last talk here that maybe the cause of anti-Semitism is rabbis causing people to do too much math. But this is the understanding that he had of this text. So amazingly, he would say, and providentially, the sum of those 5 names, those 5 generations, is 1,200. And if it's 1,200, we can ask the question, does it evenly divide by 5? In which case we can get the average value across all 5 generations. And it does. And the average value is 240, which is Amalek uncertainty itself. Meaning that in a certain sense, starting with faith on the side of holiness, like the idea of uncertainty and doubt sort of migrates to the sort of secular left and becomes oppositional over time. And this is the underwriting element that fuels a lot of conflict in politics, but it's also the very thing that causes the conflict in politics, can resolve the thing in politics, which is, again, I'm not a know-it-all. I understand reality is intrinsically fuzzy, that there are certain things that cannot be seen with an absolute consensus. If you go on many college campuses, you'll find that teens and 20-somethings have absolute conviction over everything, that they are masters of reality, commissioners of reality, self-appointed commissioners of reality. You can only be self-appointed, apparently. But this is already tempering, right, what we do with government. And of course, this temperance of government translates into, like, we can't let one person just drink their own Kool-Aid and think that they're in charge of everything. We want to have a division of powers that appears over time. And most people look in the Federalist Papers, which I have here. If you want to look it up, it's chapter 51. And it discusses the division of powers. Why do we have a legislative branch, a judicial branch, right? And we also have an executive branch. Why do we have these different executive powers? And most people trace it either to Montesquieu, because that came up before, in the 18th century, just decades earlier, the spirit of the law, because he advocates for breaking up. But truthfully, you find it in many other places as well, including in the writings of Immanuel Kant and William Blackstone. William Blackstone is really important because he's actually cited by the authors of the Federalist Papers, and he was a student of John Selden. He, not directly, but indirectly, was very influenced by John Selden. And there have now been numerous studies that actually show that it's not just Montesquieu, but in the ancient world, there was a division between the crown and the court. And so there's actually entire books that have been dedicated to this subject. In fact, there's a long document that was produced at Yale Law School all about the division of powers as seen in the Hebrew ancient Commonwealth, and where all of those things come and where they trace to. In fact, throughout Jewish history, it was very negative, like in during the Hashmonean dynasty, the second one, Yani, who after the Hanukkah episode reestablishes, and rededicates the temple, that you shouldn't have the priestly class, the Kohanim, also claim the kingship, right? Like when you start mixing the different branches of government, things go really, really badly. And we had a slightly different division. You would have the prophet, right? You would have the Supreme Court, the Sanhedrin. You would have the priestly class, and then you would have the king, right? And they're all sort of like a check on one another in terms of where things go. If we talk about the sovereign exception for a moment, I'll just mention because I'm really running out of time. I told you I didn't know how long this would take, but I'm almost done. If you talk about the sovereign exception, we already have highlighted the fact that the king is bound by the Torah itself and Torah law, and so cannot in any way suspend those dictates, and so we get a limited monarchy. And so sovereign exception means that the king is responsible for absorbing the law that he himself makes. And there are checks on that. You could be lashed for too many horses, right? Or too much stuff that's going on. So finally, I want to conclude with a famous quote from John Adams from October of 1798. Where he talks about, all of the amazingness of what America is, right? And he assumes that we can be a people where we pursue what's called the language of justice and moderation, right? But he has a problem. What would happen if this country will be a most miserable habitation in the world? Because we have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions, unbridled by morality and religion, right? He says, avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. So that's a very powerful thing to reflect on in today's day and age when we seem to be like stretching ourselves to the limit. Which brings me to the final concluding interpretation of how we understand this idea in Deuteronomy 27 to place upon ourselves a king. If you don't know Hebrew, you're going to miss nuance in the text that does not translate. All right, you shall place upon yourself a king. It actually doesn't say that exactly in Hebrew. It's sum tasim alecha melech. It actually reads, you shall place upon yourself a king. Why? I mean, pen and parchment, it's like rare commodity here. We're not going to add extra words. The idea is that the Torah in every single detail is exact. So I would say you shall place. So this double expression appears many times, and the interpretation of the Zohar, again, the work referenced by Stiles in 1770, is quite remarkable. Place, it refers to what is above, and you shall place what is below. Meaning like place God as a king above, right? An ultimate authority, an absolute authority, right? That really sees reality as it is in and of itself. And then you shall place, why is the you in the, and now it's got the subjective component, the human part. That's where we factor in. Below an earthly king, and any form of government, what is below is accountable to what is above. And if we do it in that way, then it's like we're constituting leadership and government properly according to the dictates of the Torah and what God wants, and therefore it's not problematic. But if you don't first place God above as king, then it does you no good to place a ruler below, because unto what power will the earthly king be accountable, right? Like that's the idea with this doubling of expression. And likewise, there's one other interpretation that like what you place above as the ultimate authority actually gives you a faith that there's meaning beyond what I can know, which is emunah, fundamental uncertainty of reality, that's limits of knowledge, and so there are things that are beyond knowledge, that transcend knowledge. That's what's placed above. Placing that sense of divine authority below is actually what is humbling to us. It's called shiflut. Shiflut is humility. So you have to have both epistemic humility above, which is faith, limits of knowledge. Like I don't know everything God knows, and actual humility in front of other people and God below is the place you shall place upon yourself a king. And all of this bears out from this amazingly circuitous journey that weaves through the 16th, 17th, and 18th century into Thomas Paine's pamphlet in 1776 and beyond. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take some questions, or people can run to the food, whatever you prefer. Yes?
Yeah, I'm struggling with this idea that you expressed, if I understand correctly, that the unanimous Sanhedrin would mean no decision?
Well, I said the closest thing in modern day conception would be a mistrial, right? A mistrial because no one looked deep enough. If you have 70, like it's a huge court, right? Or like you have to understand for a capital crime, we've got like the larger courts of 23 and 71, you know, that are in ancient Israel. And if not one person can find extenuating circumstances or ambiguity in reality, because it's very hard. You actually have to be quite accomplished to figure out how to be put to death in Jewish law. It's not an easy task. It's like takes real talent to be able to do it. That's why like it rarely happened, right? But it tells us something about the very limits of knowledge and even about evidence, right? Like, do I ever fully see all of reality assembled before me in such clear, unambiguous terms, right?
Two things about that. Number one, they must not have been Jews, because they all agree.
Huh?
They must not have been Jews because they all agree.
They all agree. Well, so that's why, I mean, there are many cases in the Talmud that are like thought experiments. So we don't have to make any like historical assessment of how frequently this happened or not happened, but it tells us something like very dangerous about everyone having groupthink, you know, and marching lockstep in a political or a judicial context. That like that dissenting view is really important in this particular case.
Well, that doesn't mean that there weren't dissenting views, and you know, let's say they had a conference like the Supreme Court does, but eventually they did, you know, the ones who were doubters were convinced. But I don't see why that is any more ignoring uncertainty than any other distribution of judges.
Yeah.
49 to 21, whatever.
Right, you have to have one at least. There's always a modicum, like that last level of reality is never completely precisely definable. So it creates intrinsic fuzziness or fundamental ambiguity in all real world situations. And increasingly we're starting to understand that even with the limits of measure, which is why I cited what's called Heisenberg's uncertainty principle without measuring it by name. But that applies now even in neuroscience with memory. Like there are real limits to recall, because we see like that like the very act of recalling something will augment it. So when we think of like the perfect reproduction of a state of events, whether it's narrated or evidenced in some other way, there are epistemic limits. Epistemology being the area of philosophy that asks how do we know what we know. So that's what's embedded in there.
So you've got to have Henry Fonda.
So that's 12 angry men. It's like 71 angry men on this set. Yeah. Yes.
So recently I picked up my patent about Professor a book that came out last year called The Jewish World of Alexander Hamilton. That presents that Alexander Hamilton himself, one, that his mother converted to Judaism before he was born.
Right.
And two, that he studied for a time at a Jewish school in St. Kitts and was taught Talmud there.
Yep.
Does that come into...
Absolutely. So a year ago, you should get the recording of last year's class for July. I brought in that book, and I dealt a little bit with it. That would be worthy of a topic in its own right, which is why it's preposterous to think that just because Montesquieu is the immediate source, that would be the only source of separate powers or checks and balances for someone like Hamilton. It's just, or any of these other figures. They were all conversant with Bible and even Hebraic Bible, and I brought examples of that in last time. So for sure he knew of earlier references. It probably was considered a more palatable reference for him to make. But even Montesquieu himself was certainly in a climate where there was a lot of French Hebraism happening at the time as well. And we could have cited a whole series of French texts that were drawing on Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah, and Talmud, and many other things all around Montesquieu. So that's harder to reassemble and trace those influences because Montesquieu doesn't reference them in the spirit of the laws. But nonetheless, we can definitely suspect it because of the overall climate and intellectual climate that he's in. Anybody else?
One question. Because of the rare books,
Yes.
do you have a way of keeping them in a situation that they're environmentally controlled?
So I've been trained by archivists and well-known libraries with antiquities. Yes, they don't do very well with the heat. They're pretty good in the cold. So yes, I do manage because I have even older texts than this, and they have to be attended with. Yeah, exactly. Right, and these are original bindings. So can you imagine this is lasted from 1661? It looks like it's never been read. It's kind of, it's unbelievable. The quality of what was made is quite amazing. You had a question?
Kind of ignorant to the connection between deism, Judaism, and Christianity. Is there any connection whatsoever? Because I've always heard that the founding fathers had a connection to deism.
So this is itself an open area of question for scholars. Like some come down like in that camp seemingly. It is not, if anything, it would be closer to like an import from Spinoza, who himself is a heretical Jewish thinker, than anything in normative Judaism. So that itself is worthy of exploration. Spinoza's thought already starts to shift thinking not only in European circles, especially what the German idealists, Hegel, Fichte, and Schelling, but then pours over into America and some of this thought as well. So we could trace that history. It's kind of complicated, whether it comes through him or not, but he is a non-normative Jewish thinker himself in terms of the question of deism. But there's been a lot of recent scholarship on exactly that question. Yeah. Yes? Oh, there's tons of other influences. Normally the ones that play out are like of the Greco-Roman tradition, right? Like there are certain ones that are the greatest hits. Like we mentioned Montesquieu, right? Like that's definitely for checks and balances, like the go-to along with William Blackstone, right? Those are two sources. But sometimes if you go like one state earlier, you'll see a more diverse sense of influences pouring into it. So I'm not arguing by any stretch of the imagination that everything in the Constitution was constituted by Hebraism or Jewish thought spilling over into the Christian imagination of the Puritans who saw themselves as the new Israelites. But it's a major factor that has not been sufficiently attended to. Often histories try to paint it as an outgrowth of Renaissance humanism and then the Enlightenment, right? Divorcing it from religion. But it, in fact, is a very strongly identifiable political theology that we're seeing in these texts. So that's an important correction to the historical narrative that people have given up until now. Yeah.
This was not a theme of your talk at all, but you mentioned like the Nazis, being the apocalypse of their time. And that's the first I've ever really thought about that. Is that something that was common?
Right.
That Jews at that time
Yes.
were thinking of?
Yeah, like it's all. It's always been a free-floating signifier. It's identified with as opposed to like a particular group that is biodetermined, right, by ancestry and has like a clear, unbroken historical status, right? That's what it is, which would, need to be. It's all based on behavior, right, and nothing else. So that's an important thing to understand. So yes, that would have been understood even in earlier generations of pogroms and other types of massacres that occurred. That language would have been evoked as well. Yes.
You touched on the Jews being banished and exiled from England.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, what was the influence for that to happen, and conversely, when they let them back in? Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah. So if you go back to William the Conqueror, like there's some really interesting history coming out now about early Jews at that time. It's funny, Cambridge University was founded in the 1200s by students from Oxford, over 100 years earlier, and there was like a Jewish community there at that time. There was a lot of lawlessness, and I'm not a scholar on that particular period, but there's a lot of interesting new things, even questioning whether William the Conqueror had Jewish ancestry or somehow connected to him, like really fascinating. What I can tell you that I am more versed in is that Oliver Cromwell, through the influence of John Selden, started to see Jewish thought as something standing shoulder to shoulder with not only like Christian thought, but ancient Greek wisdom and Roman wisdom. And so it was like, okay, like this is a people that is making very important contributions to the world. We should consider, whether or not they should be allowed in. We shouldn't discriminate. And actually, part of what rejected monarchy is actually traceable to Genesis, because we all have a common ancestor with Adam. So if we all trace back to Adam, so how can one human being be superior to another? Hence, you start to get this push towards political equality and acceptability of Jews and increasing of toleration. Most people attribute the toleration that occurred at that time and even after it as a result of a trend towards secularity. Right, just like they would write all this off to secular humanism and Enlightenment. But in fact, much of the toleration was religious-based toleration of the other, in this case, the Jewish other, because of a new love affair that occurred with the printing of rabbinic commentary that was helping the Renaissance period and the Enlightenment period to try to grapple with a lot of the new issues of modernity and the new political experiments that were unfolding. So,
the time frame, the Spanish, 1492, the Spanish began.
Right, the diaspora, yeah, in 1490.
But by that time, had England allowed them back in?
No, it's so the regicide of Charles II is 1649, and then Charles I, is 1649. Charles II has a somewhat reestablished throne in 1660. So it's in that window that it changes. Selden dies in 1654, so he just goes a little bit over into Cromwell's time. And that was the pivotal point. All right, well, thank you everyone for coming. I hope everyone has a wonderful 4th of July, and you can get out your common sense. We could use more common sense in the world today. And rally against the unqualified leaders that may exist in the world, as Paine did. Thank you.